Amazing. Well, many of us love stories. I know that stories are such a big thing because blockbuster movies continue to set records and books continue to be bought, most of them being bought on ebook readers these days, but many of you have probably terrors and fears in the night of different books that you were assigned as a 11th grader and a 10th grader. You feel me? 1984 and all these other books. But for you, I wanted to start out with something as we kick off this brand new series called The Story, because we are all living in a story. And we are trying to bring unity to life's biggest questions, stories and questions that define us. Questions like, where did I come from? Questions like my friend David's wrestling with this week as he lost his mom, that where do we go after we die? What is the purpose to life? What is the secret to a happy life? And if there is a good and an evil, where does that standard come from? These are all huge questions, and they're questions that as modern, if I could say that, modern Montrealers observe, and they're also questions that the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Egyptians, and culture after culture and time period after time period, these are the questions that have defined us. And so whatever story we find ourselves living in, we have to ask ourselves the question, what story am I living? And where did I get that blueprint from? But every story has an opportunity to unite us together. It has a way to make sense of life's complicated and varied questions. But great stories have this ability to bring truth to the surface without hitting you in the face. And they bring these great complicated ideas in a beautiful narrative form. And the story of God is actually the story of the Bible. It's a story that was written over thousands of years by over 40 different authors, and yet there's a profound sense of unity, that there's a story of God within all these different human and ancient civilizations that can bring answers to life's complicated questions. But for many of you, maybe you got an invite on Facebook, or maybe you were the recipient of some gum at the Ville Maria Metro. Shout out to all of our students from Ottawa for doing that this week. And for you, maybe you're just here by that invitation. And for you, you would say, you know what, I don't believe in the Bible. The Bible is a story, and it's like all good stories. There's some truth to it, but there's some myth to it also, and that's not the way that I'm going to live. And so this morning, I'm not going to ask you to take off all of your mental faculties. I'm not going to ask you to take away all of your cynical doubts. I'm just asking you to listen to a story that's existed for thousands of years over thousands of different cultures and civilizations that have tried to bring unity to this massive questions that we have. But before we did that, I want to do something a little fun, and I want to see how many linguistic experts we have, how many bookworms we have truly out there, because I have for you the top 5, at least in my opinion, the top 5 opening lines of great books. Okay, so if you can get this, I owe you a chocolate bar or an espresso right outside. Okay, if you know it, call it out, shout it at me, it's okay. First lines, great first lines from novels. Call me Ishmael. Say it out loud. Moby Dick, excellent. If you were in the first service, by the way, you can't play along. You can, if you know only if you know the answers. Okay. I'm going to get poor here really quick. Okay, Moby Dick. How many people knew it was Moby Dick? That you're too shy to put your hand up. Okay, we got a few people in the back. Okay, here's a good one. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Pride and Prejudice. Mimi, first word of the first line. We see our bookworms coming to the surface here. Everyone will get this one. One of my favorite. To me, this is the goal of writing right here, Jason. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. The season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Is that beautiful language? Shout out to Charles Dickens. Man. Tale of Two Cities, 1859. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of junk. But I don't feel like going into it if you really want to know the truth. Catcher in the Rye, 1951. Finally, this story has been recently made into a movie. I'll give you guys a little bit of a hint, a little bit of scene trivia before the movie starts, okay? In my younger, more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Great Gatsby, nicely done. 1925. Round of applause to all of our amazing participants. Today we're going to begin, like all good stories, with the opening line of the story. We're going to see the beginning part of the story of God, and this book that was part of a book of 66 books, because really the Bible is not one book, it's an anthology. It's a collection of 66 different books written by 40 different authors, many different time periods, many different civilizations, many different ways of thinking, and that there's a sense of unity. And as we're going to see week after week over the next 12 weeks, you're going to see these themes emerge over and over again. And the two questions we're going to be asking over and over again, week after week, are these questions. What do we learn about God in this story? Second question, what do we learn about us in this story? Because we've used this story tagline that the greatest life is going to be found in the greatest story. The Bible has universally been acknowledged as a beautiful piece of literature. Again, whether you believe that it's authoritative, whether you believe that God inspired it and wrote it and it's without error or not, at least if you could read it just with the sense that this is a beautiful piece of literature, and then ask the question as we go on, could it bring unity to my life? Because as we think about those major questions of where I came from, what's the meaning of life? What's the sense of right and wrong, and who gets to decide that? And where am I going after I die? The best question that we have to answer as we think about those monstrous questions is which system, which story brings the best sense of unity and explanation to those big stories in our complicated world? Which explanation makes the best sense of our world today and of my life today? And so today we're going to begin in the beginning of the story, but before we do that, every civilization, every culture has answered this question of origin, where we came from, in different ways. The ancient Babylonians, for example, and even there's an Ugaritic myth, which is another civilization kind of close by in the ancient Near East, in the Middle East today, modern-day Middle East. As they surveyed what was there, the seas and the mountains and the animals in the water and the animals on the ground, and they're mammals, I know they're not animals in the ocean, but sometimes they slide in and out, right? So I am not a botanist or a zoologist, just in case you're confused about that. However, we see that in this story, people have always tried to answer where we came from. They've always tried to make sense of this complicated world. And if you've ever woken up on a Monday morning or Tuesday morning and been arrested by the sense of beauty. Maybe it's been a foggy morning, there's been a mysterious fog over the city, or maybe a fresh blanket of snow, or maybe the first colors that emerge, these yellows and oranges and reds. My favorite time of year is right now, by the way. I love fall. How many people love fall? Yeah. There's a beauty in fall, right? Some of you are foreboding because of what's after fall, but just sip the fall espresso for a little bit with me. Just sip the apple cider, enjoy the pumpkin, enjoy the apple for what it is. But back to what I was saying earlier, every civilization, every culture has tried to make sense of this thing that they see, the colors and the smells and the complicated life and the diversity of animals and the birds of the sky. In Babylon, in the ancient Near East, in the year about 1500 BC, their explanation of how the world came into existence was very similar to all the other civilizations in that time period. They were kind of polytheistic system, which means that they believed in many gods. And so as they surveyed the mountains, as they surveyed the waters and all the animals and all the life that emerged, they said that in Babylon, for example, Marduk, their god, their supreme being, defeated the goddess Tiamat in this epic storm battle. The storm, the god of the sea and the god of the storms wrestled together, and this god Marduk prevailed and scattered the remains brutally, taking the eyes of Tiamat and taking the hair and all this other stuff of the goddess and sprinkling it around the universe. And out of that emerged water, and out of that emerged mountains, and out of that emerged complicated life, and out of that emerged beauty. And so as they surveyed what was, their answer to how we got here was that the gods conspired in this chaotic battle, and we are the result of that chaotic battle. And many other civilizations in that same way answered it with this idea of many, many gods wrestling together, one ultimately prevailing over the others. And so that's why, for example, for many many people today, we still worship the sun, we worship the stars, we worship the god of the moon. People still look to those answers through zoology and different ways of zodiac signs and trying to find meaning in life because there's a profound mystery to the universe. But in our modern, sophisticated world, we don't believe in many gods. We don't believe in this storm god and this sea god wrestling together, and that's how emerged. Like, we're too sophisticated for that, aren't we? We are far too sophisticated to believe in many, many gods and this epic battle going back and forth and this coming out of nothing. That we've been taught, and we've been kind of on the heels for the last couple of hundred years of this idea that matter matters. What we see is what we get. And what we see came from randomness, that atoms started colliding back and forth in such a way over millions and billions of years, that these atoms collided to created this complicated system of life, and increasingly more complicated, increasingly more sophisticated. And maybe you've heard this, that it's the survival of the fittest, and so that macroevolution that existed allowed us to get from these small, primitive cells into these more complicated animals, and finally into these amazing creatures that I'm sitting in front of and standing in front of right now, these beautiful, profound, deep creatures. You guys emerged from randomness and this progression of one common ancestor. And so out of that philosophy, out of that explanation of the universe, we have to admit that that's a pretty sophisticated view, that back in 1836 and 1840, when Charles Darwin was writing The Origin of the Species, that he was trying to make sense of everything that he saw and all those big questions we talked about earlier. And his explanation was that we came from nothing, and that we exist in a vacuum, and we exist because of random chance, and there's nothing overarching above us or below us, that we are what we are, and we celebrate what is, and there's nothing before and there's nothing after. There's a story behind that, though, isn't there? That's a system of belief that answers the question of origin, and it answers the question of life's meaning, and it answers the question of morality, and it answers the question even of destiny. If you don't believe me, Charles Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion and many other books promoting atheism, naturalism, evolutionism, which are really pretty similar tribes. This is what he says about his explanation, his idea of what he observes. Again, in this living out of the story that matter matters, and matter is all we have, that we came from nothing, we're going back to nothing. This is what that story tells us about life. This is what he says. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect there is. At bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's from Richard Dawkins' the book River Out of Eden. If that doesn't wake you up and make you feel warm and fuzzy in the morning, I don't know what will. We are here from blind, pitiless existence. That's like a big blanket you can put on a cold day, right? But again, that's the story of naturalism. That's the story that is making sense of these complicated questions. And if you live in that story, if you live with that worldview, what you're saying is that there is no right and wrong. There is no justice. There's nothing to look to. There's no supreme being overarching your problems and my problems. There's just random chance that happens. Just like randomness brought us into the world, randomness will continue in our existence until finally we expire. That is the story. And many, many people, millions and billions of people are living in that story because that's a popular worldview. It's the worldview being promoted in our education system. It's the worldview that I learned growing up in elementary school, junior high, high school. It's the worldview that is a direct rebuttal against the story that we're going to read today. And so whether or not you find yourself in that story, or if this story is the story that you're familiar with, the question that you should wrestle with is the big question is, which one makes the best sense? Which one brings the best unity to these big questions? But before we do that, I want to ask that God would help us this morning. That we're going to read in a moment just how the Spirit of God began this whole creation existence. And we believe that the Spirit of God, that God's presence is here, opening up His Word and His story together. We're going to ask that God would just suspend our problems, suspend the pressures on us, and that we could be present for just a few minutes together just to hear that if it's possible that God exists, what implications that has for your life and mine. Can we do that? God, today, we want to open up your story. We know that for millions of people today in our world who hold this story to be sacred, who hold this story to be true, it's not without its challenges. It's not without needing faith. But God, it's been comforting, and it has made a huge difference in our civilization. And yet, God, today we need your help. We know that many of us have been hurt. Many of us have been shielded from the truth. And many of us, God, are struggling to make unity of all these questions that we wrestle with. So, God, I ask that your Spirit of God would be with us. And as we open up your story in this week and the weeks to come, that you would help us to wrestle with these questions, and that you would help us to see truth emerge, and that it would bring comfort and strength and greater unity, not only to our civilization and our city, but especially to my soul and to our souls together, that you would help us to have peace as we can discover and uncover who you are and who we are because of that story. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. So we're going to read the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is Genesis, and the word Genesis means beginnings. So if you ever wonder what the word Genesis means, it's the beginnings. And the structure of Genesis is interesting. You'll see several different sections start. So this is the story of. This is the story of. This is the story of creation. This is the story of Abraham. This is the story of Noah. This is the story of Isaac. It goes on and on and on. Several different times giving you a marker, just like every good author, it gives you a good map of where it's going. And so the beginning is starting with the story of God. And that's where we want to start today. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we're going to read all the way to chapter 2, verse 3. In the beginning, great opening line. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. I want you to pay attention to the repetition. Pay attention to the rhyme. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters, and he called them seas. And God saw that it was good. Verse 11. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds, according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing in it in which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, over the wild animals, and all the living creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. All the guys say, amen. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and to the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. And by the seventh day, God finished the work that he was doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work he was creating that he had done. This is the beginning of the story of God. Interesting story, right? It's a different story than the story that matter matters, that matter is all that existed. It's a different story than the story that we came from randomness, that we came from this complicated system of evolution, that we're becoming more and more complicated as the millennia have gone on. This story has a certain rhythm, a certain cadence to it, a certain drumbeat to it, doesn't it? In fact, if you read Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 side by side, you'll see some differences. And some people have said, that's an example of how the Bible is contradictory. But that is a style of literature. Every style of literature has to be read in its context. And what we see in Genesis 1 and 2 is two different accounts of the same story. You see that also in the story of the parting of the Red Sea. There's the story of how it took place historically, and then there's a song written about it. There's a story about how Mary, the mother of Jesus, is announced as this mother of the coming Messiah. And then there's Mary's observation of that same event written in the next chapter. And so what we see in the story of Genesis is not two contradictory accounts, but two different perspectives. One is a poem, one is a song, which is the one I just read. The second would be more like a grandfather passing it on to his grandson, generation after generation after generation. In fact, storytelling is so powerful that until the year 1500, that was the way that we got truth. Did you know that? There was no printing press. There wasn't everyone having a Bible that is gaining dust on their bookshelf. We encountered truth. We encountered answers to these stories by hearing these stories over and over again. That was our entertainment. That was the way that we passed on truth. That was the way that we made sense of these complicated questions. And so generation after generation would tell these stories in its order. And there's a way that God's wired us to hear and to enjoy stories. But were you paying attention to the rhythm of Genesis 1? Because the author of Genesis was trying to help us to see that there's something in there that has a great implications. Not just the fact that there might be a supreme being out there, but the way in which this supreme being came about and to bring things into existence is what the author wanted to emphasize. So just by rude red pen last night, I went through and I circled all of the repetition that I saw, at least the ones that were emerging for me. And as I saw that, and as you listen to the story, I'm sure you saw a couple of things that were repeated over and over again. The first thing that's repeated throughout this beginning of the story, it says, "And God said." And God said. 9 different times in this first chapter of the story, and God said. It wasn't like God had a committee and he got a supervisor together and he called the engineers and he called the business people and he called the sales force together. We're going to try this and we're going to do this. No, God said. That's how it happened. And immediately following that, what was the second repetition? And it was so. And God said, and it was so. God said something, it came. God said something, it came. God thought it, it happened. God said it, he did it. God said it, he did it. Rhythm. And God said, and it was so. And at the end of every one of those sections, what happened? And it was good. And God said, and it was so, and it was good. A rhythm that this author wants us to not miss. That the answer to the question that many of us wrestle with, where did we come from? What is the meaning of life? The answer in the story of God is that we came from a supreme being. We came from an intelligent designer. This designer said, I said it, and I did it. Said it, and did it. I didn't have to take all this raw material, this clay, and these rocks, and these granite, and these different blueprints together, and come up with a committee and start to delegate it. That this designer, that this story tells us that there is somebody so much greater than us, that by his word alone, that we came out of existence. Not by plans, not by blueprints, not by committees, not by studying the ancient wisdom, but that in and of this person's being. Again, we don't know from the story if this is a he or a she or an it, but there is a supreme being in the story that says something, and it was so. Wouldn't you love that to be the case for your work? Man. Showing up on Monday morning for your check-in meeting with your team, just thinking something, and it was so, right? The report is gleaming in front of you. You can hand it out, right? All the sales force is assembled, and you've got all these leads. I'm thinking it, I'm saying it, and I've got 100 new clients, right? I'm thinking it, my kids are going to be organized today. My kids are going to listen to me today, and it was so. Moms, I'm going to think that my kids are going to be respectful today. They're going to eat their vegetables today. They're going to say, yes, ma'am, they're going to be respectful to me. And it was so. That would be cool. And it was good. And God said, and it was so, and it was good. A rhythm over and over in the story. Again, what story are you living in? The story that Richard Dawkins is promulgating, the story that Charles Dawkins before him, The Origin of the Species, was trying to explain the world by a brilliant idea. We have to give him credit. A brilliant idea that something this could emerge out of nothing, and isolating science to this one island, Galapagos Islands, and trying to observe that over millions of years, possibly what happened is this and this. That's a brilliant theory. Brilliant. But the answer and the implications of that story is incredibly damaging. Richard Dawkins, again, said, you're going to have these physical forces that just happen to you. You're going to get hurt. You're going to get abused. You're going to be on the wrong side of justice. And there's no rhyme and there's no reason to it. You don't come from anything. You're not going back to anything. There's no one to look to when you're in trouble. That is a story that makes sense of my origin and my meaning and my purpose in life and my destiny. But what the story of God is trying to help us to see, again, you might be skeptical today, and we love skeptics, because you know why? God loves skeptics. I was once a skeptic. Maybe you were once a skeptic. But what I want you to do if you find yourself in those shoes today, wrestling with these two very different accounts of the creation of the world, is I want you just to listen, especially this week and the coming 11 weeks, that you would come back and listen to the story with this kind of attitude. Is it possible that this story is the true story, and that my life will find the greatest meaning inside of this story? Now, we see some things about God in the story. Again, the two questions we always want to wrestle with as we read these stories week after week is, what do we learn about God? And what do we learn about us as a result? What do we learn about God, and what do we learn about ourselves? Well, in this account, we see several things that we see about God, don't we? God is creator. In the beginning, God created. The first verb, created. He brought life out of nothing. In the ancient language, it's ex nihilo. It's literally bringing something out of nothing. That he is so powerful that he was able to speak something, and it was so, and it was good. Didn't need to be improved upon. There was no iPhone 7, iPhone 8, iPhone 9. There was just perfection to begin with, and it was called good. Now, I got a creative mind sometimes, and I can just imagine God after every day. This is, again, me promoting my humanness on God, which is sometimes unfair to do, but it helps me make sense of this story. I can picture God kicking off his boots at the end of the day, grabbing some lemonade with some ice cubes in it, the condensation rolling off the glass onto this table on the porch, and kind of in a rocking chair going back and forth, surveying what he had just worked so hard to make, looking at the sun gleaming in the sky, maybe surveying the whales jumping in the ocean, maybe surveying the intricacy of a spider web forming outside of his porch. And he takes a sip of a long, cold glass of lemonade and says, "It is good." So God is the creator. I think from the story we can easily see that God is intelligent, that God didn't have to have a second iteration, that he didn't have to improve upon anything, that he didn't make something out of chaos like the ancient Babylonian system would say that the world came into existence, that it was chaotic and somehow it became more complicated and better. In the same way, the naturalism or evolutionism became brutal and chaotic and became more and more beautiful, more and more complicated. In fact, God, it says here in the story, made everything good from the very beginning, and he spoke it. That's all he did. He spoke it. That's power, right? That's the third thing we see about God. He's the creator. He's intelligent. Il est très fort, right? Si grand et si puissant. I learned that when I was like 7 or 8. I'm bringing it back. Mon Dieu est si grand. Imagine if you had that kind of power, right? Just to speak something, and it was so, and it was good. To bring it into the classroom, to bring it into your business, to bring it into the thing that you're building. And it was said, and it was done, and it was good. I would love that to be the case for me. But you know what? There's only one being like this. That's what we see in the story. We see also that this God is relational, don't we? It says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and it says, "Let us make mankind in our image." Well, who's the us? We have to be respectful to this text because it doesn't tell us here that there is this system of Jesus. We don't know who Jesus is. The ancient writers of this wouldn't even know his name. But there's a hint in the story that when it says, "Let us make mankind in our image," there seems like there's this profound sense of power, this profound sense of community, this profound sense of love, that there's something other than just a being. There's a sense of community, a sense of love there. And the text says, "Let us make mankind into our image." He created them what? Male and female. Now, we had like 60 junior high students from my home church in Ottawa today. And I know that many of the grade 6 and 7s would say, "I don't even really like females. Like, life would be better if I could just hang out with my boys." But let's give it a couple years, guys. I'm telling you, things will change rapidly. Sterling? It'll change. Male and female. We see God is relational. Not only does he create us in a relationship with each other, that we are brothers and sisters in a sense, that we have one designer and we're all products of that creator, but also that God has created us for diversity, that we're supposed to be in a relationship with people unlike us. That one of the best ways to be human is not only to enjoy the creator, but is to be in relationship with someone that's other than us. Someone who doesn't come from the same background. Someone who doesn't think like us, someone who has a different story, someone who doesn't look like us, someone who doesn't come to the same conclusions as us. That is a profound sense of what the designer intended, that he created us different on purpose. And there's a profound beauty, and we have to admit, a complication with that, don't we? In fact, we're going to see next week, just to give you a bit of a preview, the question we'll be answering, which is one of the biggest questions you'll ever wrestle with, is why is there suffering in our world? Why is there evil in the world? If this is true about God and he's so good, then why are people suffering? Why is there poverty? Why is there disease? And so what we look at tomorrow, or not tomorrow, next Sunday, is the answer to the question, why is that the case? And if God created us diverse and he created us on purpose like that, why is it so hard for us to come together with that? And the answer to that question will be in the story next week. I'll tease you guys with that. Cliffhanger. This week, I have some really dear friends from the church give me 2 tickets to the Montreal Canadiens and Ottawa Senators preseason game. And so we got to take the metro. We hopped on at Snowden over here on Queen Mary, and we took the metro downstairs with my 9-year-old son, Sterling. And it was our first time to go to a game together. They've been begging me since, they were this high. Now they're this high. Dad, we got to go to a game, And he's been to some hockey games before. He's been to some, games in NDG. There's like 8 or 9 people, mostly moms, in the stands. It's very, very different when there's 20,000 raucous fans with got some Molson Canadian coursing through their veins. You know what I'm saying? And we had an awesome time. It was such what a gift that we got to go together and to enjoy that experience. We had amazing seats, had a great experience, and the food just tastes better at a live hockey game, and you can feel the hits coming forward and the energy in the crowd. But I was looking over at my son at one point in the game, just kind of like as a dad, you like to see him enjoying the game, and he started counting down. He's like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. I'm like, what's going to happen? Am I looking for a bomb or something? 3, 2, 1. At the end of it, the puck ran off the crossbar. This loud noise, and the crowd erupted with a cheer. And I was like, man, my kid's like psychic or something. He knows exactly what's going to happen. And so I'm like, Sterling, what are you doing? He's like, well, I have this amazing sense of when a great play is going to happen in a hockey game. I'm like, he's a special kid, but that's pretty amazing. And so he tried it again a couple minutes later. He's like, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. And again, something amazing happened. So I'm going to try that. If he's my kid, I should be able to do that. He's made in my image, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to start at 10 this time. 10, 9, 8, and there's like nothing. There's no puck around. It's just like blank. Nothing happened. In the story of God, God says it, and it happens. God doesn't have to work at it. He just thinks it and says it, and emerges these mountains, and emerges these colors, and emerges this beauty, and emerges all of the complicated life that we see today. God said it, it was good. God said it, it was so, and it was good. What a great rhythm to that. How many people know what the word Fiat means? How many people have heard the car, the Fiat, the Italian cute little car, right? The word Fiat, everyone say Fiat with me. Fiat. We've got to learn some new vocabulary today. I always want to brush up on my vocabulary. So, a fiat is a decree from a supreme being. It could be from a king or a governor, and so it shall be written, so it shall be done, right? In here we see the ultimate example of a divine fiat. This supreme, intelligent, good, powerful God speaking life, and life emerges. Speaking beauty, and beauty emerges. Speaking diversity, and diversity emerges. You see, back when Charles Dawkins was writing The Origin of the Species, Charles Darwin was writing this book, he was thinking at the time that as we became more sophisticated with our scientific instruments and as the technology developed, that we would discover as we get down to the cell level that things would be very, very primitive. Things would be very, very easy to describe how something from very primitive could be something very complex into a human being or into an animal. But the problem is, as science has progressed, as technology has advanced, as the Hubble telescope, for example, and microscopes have developed, they've discovered that at the primitive cell level, there is a profound sense of complexity. It is ultimately way more complex than they could have ever dreamed. And so this idea that if we get down to the irreducible minimum, that we'll discover that there's a very simple explanation to life. In fact, as they got down deeper, there's DNA in every cell. There is complications here that we could not have even imagined 100 years ago. And so again, what story makes the most sense of the evidence? Philip Johnson, who is a law professor and ethicist at UC Berkeley, says it this way: the contradiction between the Bible and science is a bad dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. He says this: the real battle is not between the Bible and science, but between science as unbiased empirical observation on the one hand, and science as applied naturalistic philosophy on the other. You see, the reason why Darwinism, the reason why naturalism, it continues to be taught as truth, is because there is a vested interest in teaching this and being reminded of this. The science doesn't back it up ultimately. We can agree that there is microevolution, there are small changes in certain things, but the idea that we could evolve from a common ancestor or that this complicated universe could have ever existed out of a gas is laughable. The science does not back it up. And whether or not you choose to believe that, that's up to you. But as Philip Johnson says, the reason why we still continue to have these books and these conversations and these curriculum, it's not because the science backs it up. It's because there is a naturalistic philosophy in there. Because that brings an order to the big questions of life. And if I can take God out of the equation, that means I can define reality. That means I can define what's right and wrong. That means I can make whatever path I want to make. And so even here at the very beginning of the story, we see that we have a freedom, that mankind has a freedom to choose how they respond. Well, as we close here, we see what God is. God is intelligent, He's powerful, He's relational, He's good. So who are we as a result of that? It says that God made us in His image. Now picture this. Everyone can picture a mirror, right? You look in front of the mirror, you get your makeup on, right? Make sure your teeth, you don't have anything green inside. You're looking good in the morning. Well, a mirror reflects reality, doesn't it? What if you put a rock in front of a mirror? What would happen? Nothing. The rock wouldn't move. You would just see a reflection of a rock, right? What happens if you put a candle that was burning in the mirror? Suddenly you'd see the flame flickering back and forth. You see a movement. You see the image reflecting the image. You see this movement back and forth, this dance that's happening. And the story of God tells us that God made us in His image. And if God made us like that to reflect that candle going back and forth in the wind, that means that whatever is true about God could be said of us. If God is relational, then He has wired us for relationships. If God is intelligent, then we have intelligence right down to the DNA level within us. And if God took the pleasure, and if God took the time to make us in His image, in Genesis 2 it says that God breathed the very breath of life into our nostrils. And so let me just shock you for a second. As Adam and Eve exhaled their first breath, they were exhaling the breath of God. That God made us on purpose. And because you and I are made in the image of God, the story tells us that you and I will never lock eyes with someone who is not valuable. Everybody at the DNA level has God stamped on their DNA. Have you ever picked out something in your pocket or your jeans or your shoes and seen expected by number 132 or inspected by number 10? Like all these little slips of paper coming out everywhere, right? Usually you don't find it till the fifth or sixth wash. It's kind of wadded in there. But if you were to open up your DNA, if you were to open up to all that complicated stuff that I can't even begin to describe to you because I'm not that smart, and many of you are, I'm not, you would see made in God's image right on your cellular level. And that you and I will never lock eyes with someone who is not loved, who is not valued because of who God is. Not because of what we did, but because of who God is. And in our society today, this is a story that came up in the National Post in the last couple of weeks, that there are ethical questions being asked all the time in our medical community. Questions like, what do we do if someone is not really, quote unquote, useful for society anymore? What if we discover that in the DNA testing before they're born that they're going to have a hard life, that they're not going to have their mental faculties, or maybe they won't be physically strong? And if this is not the story that you live your life by, the story instead is the Richard Dawkins or the Charles Darwin story, the question is not what God says of who you are. The question is what is most financially responsible. And so we start to make questions like, well, is that going to be a drain on the economy to bring this person into the world? Is it better for society for us to lower our expenses and allow this person to die rather than for caring for that person and rather for giving them some kind of a quality of life that won't ever be like ours? And without this idea that God made us in His image, what we start to do is start trading value of people based on what they can do for us or what kind of value they have intellectually or what kind of gifts that they have. And God says that every single person, whether wounded or scarred, whether born with a deformity or not, is profoundly and beautifully made in God's image. And every single person has value, even that neighbor that gives you grief, even that teacher that has no patience for you, even the person that brushes by you in the subway and almost knocks you down. Every single person is made in God's image. And you are valuable to God because God made you, and God is good, and he called you good. Finally, God said that you are to rule and to reign over creation. And we're not really comfortable with that, right? Like, that seems like that's a lot of power. Like, I kind of like power. But, instead of coming randomly, God says that you're supposed to rule and reign, not in an abusive way, but you're supposed to be a steward, a manager of God's creation, and to take care of what God has entrusted to us, to take care of the waters, to take care of the trees, to take care of the animals, that God has endowed us with responsibility, that we're not here by chance and randomness, that God has actually put us in charge of taking care of what was most precious to God before we entered into the story. We're to take care of and to bless and to promote the animals and the trees and to take care of what God has given to us as a governor or a authoritative person. So as we close, what is the response to this idea? That God is supreme, that God is powerful, that God is intelligent, that we are valuable because God made us in his image, that we are relational beings. So what, right? Well, again, if you're in that cynical spot where you're just trying to test the waters of faith, and maybe you're coming back to church for the first time in years, or maybe the first time, I just want you to be open to the fact that there could be possibly an answer to life's complicated questions and your story in the story of God. What if it's true that there is a supreme being who said it and it was so and called it good? What if he made you on purpose? And what if your life has meaning and has value because this good and intelligent God brought you into his story? What if that's true? Secondly, if you're in the camp where you've heard this story and you believe this story, you try to live by this story, there was a person that wrote 1000 BC, so 3,000 years ago, as he was contemplating what he saw, the beautiful mountains, as he was considering the fall foliage, as he was considering the smells of pumpkins and apples in the air, as he was considering the beauty of the Mediterranean Ocean, as he was looking at the starry skies and considering how vast and how big and how powerful God is, he wrote this song. It's called Psalm 8. And if that's you today, I think the best way to respond to that kind of God is in thanksgiving. We're almost in that Thanksgiving season. We call it worship, which means to describe worthiness of somebody that's greater than us. And what if the key to a successful life was finding our story in God's grand story? David's going to write these words as we play it to a video. And I want you just to listen to these words and look at these images and be reminded that if it's true that God exists, and if it's true that he brought the creation, the beautiful creation of the world into existence, who is man? Who am I that God would stoop down to my level and form me and breathe his life into me? Who am I? I'm just going to let that question hang in the air as we watch this video, as we respond to the worthiness of this kind of God, this supreme and good and intelligent and powerful relational being, as we think about what that means for our life.